This is the fourth poem. We are looking at mental cases. Before we get to the poem itself, I thought I would take a moment to explain mental illnesses or mental illness and how they a very rough breakdown of how they work. So, when faced with something stressful, the human brain creates cortisol, which induces the fight, flight, freeze sensation. Alright, we either want to fight it, we want to run away from it, or we freeze unsure of what to do. Now, originally, this evolutionary trait was to serve the purpose of survival. So when humans were chased by a woolly mammoth or something similar, cortisol would be secreted in the brain and we would run away. Now the difference is, a woolly mammoth chases you for like 10 minutes. So the cortisol is meant to serve a short-term purpose. When a chemical like cortisol is produced for or over long periods of time, like fighting in a 4-year-long war, or being in an abusive environment, which you're in for hours, days, weeks, etc. at a time, it creates a chemical imbalance in the brain, and it's this imbalance which causes mental illnesses. Mental cases. Who are these? Why sit they here in twilight? Wherefore rock they, purgatorial shadows, drooping tongues from jaws that slob their relish, bearing teeth that leer like skulls' tongues wicked, stroke on stroke of pain. But what slow panic gouged these chasms round their fretted sockets? Ever from their hair and through their hand palms misery swelters. Surely we have perished sleeping and walk hell, but who these hellish? These are men whose minds the dead have ravished. Memory fingers in their hair of murders, multitudinous murders they once witnessed. Wading sloughs of flesh these helpless wander, treading blood from lungs that had loved laughter. Always they must see these things and hear them, batter of guns and shatter of flying muscles, carnage incomparable and human squander, rucked too thick for these men's extrication. Therefore still their eyeballs shrink tormented back into their brains, because on their sense sunlight seems a blood smear, night becomes blood black, dawn breaks open like a wound that bleeds afresh. Thus their heads wear this hilarious, hideous, awful falseness of set smelling corpses. Thus their hands are plucking at each other, picking at the rope-knouts of their scourging, snatching after us who smote them, brother, pouring us who dealt them war and madness. Who are these? Why sit they here in twilight? Techniques we have are rhetorical question and apostrophe. Now, apostrophe is where they are referring to or talking about someone who is not speaking in the poem. In this case, the soldiers. The effect, it positions the reader to consider the soldiers as patients in a mental ward. Right? It evokes sympathy in the reader for the patients. Wherefore rock they, purgatorial shadows, drooping tongues from jaws that slob their relish, bearing teeth that leer like skulls' tongues wicked. Techniques we have, visual imagery and simile. The bearing teeth that leer like skulls' tongues wicked is the simile. Alright, the effect, it depicts the physical symptoms of the patients. Alright, they're physically rocking in their seat, drooling, facial spasms, alright, etc. It establishes how jarring and uncomfortable this part of the hospital is. How uncomfortable it is seeing the soldiers like this. But what slow panic gouged these chasms round their fretted sockets? Techniques we have, caesura and personification. Now the caesura, so before the but, we've got a hyphen, and obviously before the hyphen we have the first half of that line. So a caesura is where there is a pause caused by punctuation within a line of poetry. And then personification, the panic gouging these chasms around their eye sockets, and of course the eye sockets being fretted themselves. The effect, this emphasizes the physical impact that these mental illnesses have inflicted that were inflicted by the war, the physical impact that they have had on the soldiers. Surely we have perished sleeping, and walk hell, but who these hellish? The techniques we have are enjambment and alliteration. So enjambment, where we don't have punctuation marks at the end of lines of poetry, so after perish there's no punctuation there, and alliteration, the repeated consonant sounds at the start of consecutive or closely grouped words. Hell, who, hellish, right? That repeated H sound. The effect, the soldiers have died mentally during the war in their sleep, and when they've woken up, their consciousness has been taken over by something hellish, right? The mental illnesses. That's sort of who they are now, and their true sense of self is gone. These are men whose minds the dead have ravished. So techniques, hyperphora and juxtaposition. Now, hyperphora is where the persona answers their rhetorical question. So the end of that first stanza ends in a rhetorical question, and the start of this second stanza starts with the answer. Now, juxtaposition. Now, juxtaposition is on the word ravished, right? Now, to ravish something is to love something. So the idea that the dead, these people that they have witnessed die or that they have killed themselves, have been loving their minds is what the juxtaposition is. Of course, if it was ravaged, then that would make more sense directly, because, you know, the dead are ravaging the mind. They are pillaging and destroying the mind. But the fact that they are ravishing the mind, that's what the juxtaposition is. Alright, the effect confirms the soldiers are the patients, and it begins to describe the experience of their mental illnesses, right? Those who have died, which the patients have either killed or witnessed dying, have clung to and stayed in their minds. What this is describing is the clinical term of rumination, where you sit and think on the same thing over and over again. Always they must see these things and hear them. Batter of guns and shatter of flying muscles. Carnage incomparable and human squander, rucked too thick for these men's extrication. Techniques, hyperbole, right? Always they must. And auditory imagery, because what's being described is what the soldiers and what the patients hear. The effect, this emphasizes the depiction of the soldiers' mental illnesses, right? They constantly relive the battles they have been in, and so this further shows or illustrates that sensation of rumination, right? They're constantly just sitting and thinking about this over and over again. And if we go back to that definition with mental illnesses being cortisol being secreted as a result of stress, if you're sitting and thinking about the battles that you've been in and people that you have killed and that you've seen dying over and over again, right, that cortisol is going to continue to be secreted, and that mental illness is just going to get worse. Sunlight seems a blood smear, night becomes blood black, dawn breaks open like a wound that bleeds afresh. Techniques we have symbolism, the blood is what the symbolism is, and sibilance, sunlight seems, that repeated S sound. The effect, the passage of time, so day to night and vice versa, is ultimately the same, covered in blood. When the soldiers wake, i.e. that dawn breaks open, that blood filters everything that the soldiers see and experience all over again. Alright, so the blood is symbolic of the soldiers' warped perspectives as a result of mental illnesses, right? Blood is tainting the soldiers' perspectives, how they see the world, life, etc. The other side of the symbolism is the color red. Obviously, blood is red. Red is usually associated with anger and madness. Thus their heads wear this hilarious, hideous, awful falseness of set-smelling corpses. Thus their hands are plucking at each other, picking at the rope-knouts of their scourging. Techniques, we have repetition of thus there and consonance. Now, consonance is where the vowel sound looks like it should be the same, but is pronounced differently. So heads wear and knots and scourging. The effect, it illustrates how the soldiers look and their habitual motions. It draws ties between what the soldiers have experienced and their symptoms, right? So that it's been talking about having seen other soldiers die, having killed other soldiers, having been in battle and war, and all of that. This is the direct result of those experiences. You know, it makes sense that after these experiences, this is how their madness would manifest. Snatching after us who smote them, brother. Pouring us who dealt them war and madness. Techniques we have: inclusive pronoun, so us, and active voice. Right? It is us who did the smiting or smoting. It is us who dealt them war and madness. Now, the inclusive pronoun puts the persona on the same side as the reader, and then puts the soldiers or patients as the other. So it depicts the soldiers attempting to mete out revenge on those they see as having caused their illnesses. Snatching, trying to snatch the person that's damned them, and pouring out, trying to hit those who have caused the war. It also creates a divide between the reader and the soldiers, between those in power, i.e. the reader, and those without. And of course, we could also extrapolate that between those in power, i.e. those who caused the war, and those without power, those who fought in the war.